Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped neatly through the brass slot of Rose Cottage, as though it had every right to be there. It was an ordinary-looking envelope, cream in colour, addressed in a careful hand that favoured restraint over flourish. Nothing about it suggested urgency, let alone danger. And yet, by the end of the day, it would alter the quiet village in ways no one could have predicted. Miss Marple was in her sitting-room when it arrived, seated by the window with her knitting balanced lightly in her hands. She noticed the sound at once, the soft scrape of paper against metal, followed by the familiar thud on the hall rug. She did not rise immediately. Letters, she had found, benefited from a moment's patience. They revealed more when one was not eager to open them. When she did retrieve it, she examined the envelope carefully. The handwriting was precise, controlled, and faintly old-fashioned. There was no return address. That, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely accidental. She slit it open with a small silver knife and unfolded the single sheet inside. The contents were brief. No greeting, no signature, just a few lines written with unmistakable deliberation. Miss Marple read them once, then again. Her expression did not change, but her hands still. Outside, the village went about its morning routines, unaware that something had already begun to shift. Mrs. Carter hung out her washing with brisk efficiency. The butcher arranged his display. Children passed along the lane, their voices bright and unconcerned. Nothing outwardly suggested that the day would be any different from countless others before it. The letter, however, suggested otherwise. By midday, whispers had begun to circulate, not about the letter itself, few knew of its existence yet, but about its consequences. Miss Marple had taken a short walk into the village, and she noticed the signs immediately. Conversations broke off when she approached. People smiled a little too quickly. There was a curious tension beneath the usual pleasantries, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum. At the post office she encountered Mrs. Ellery, who was known for her excellent memory and her poor discretion. "Strange business," Mrs. Ellery said, leaning closer than necessary. "Have you heard?" "Heard what?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Well, I probably shouldn't say," Mrs. Ellery replied, saying it anyway. "But someone's been asking questions. Private questions." Miss Marple nodded as though mildly interested. "Questions do have a way of finding answers." "Yes," Mrs. Ellery said, glancing around, "and not everyone wants theirs found." By the time Miss Marple reached the village green, she had heard 3 different versions of the same unease. Someone had received something they ought not to have. Someone else was very keen to ensure it went no further. No one could quite say what it was, only that it mattered. The afternoon brought a small gathering at the vicarage, arranged on short notice and explained away as a routine meeting. Miss Marple, who had not been invited, was unsurprised. She had noticed, over the years, that secrecy tended to attract attention more efficiently than openness ever could. From her window, she later observed several familiar figures arriving and leaving in close succession, their expressions composed but strained. One man exited the vicarage wiping his brow, though the air was cool. Another paused before departing, glancing back at the door as though half expecting it to call him back. The letter rested now on Miss Marple's writing desk, weighted lightly with a paper knife. She had not spoken of it. She did not need to. The village, she knew, was already reacting to its presence without knowing where it lay. As evening approached, the first overt attempt was made. There was a knock at her door, hesitant but persistent. Miss Marple opened it to find a woman she had known for years, a woman whose smile had always been reliable until now. "I was just passing," the woman said quickly. "Thought I'd check in." "How kind," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let her in. They spoke of nothing important at first, weather, health, small inconveniences. Then inevitably the conversation circled closer. "There are rumors," the woman said lightly. "Silly things, really. People exaggerate." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They often do." The woman's gaze drifted just briefly toward the writing desk. If anything odd were to come your way, she said, it might be best not to take it too seriously. Miss Marple smiled gently. I find seriousness tends to choose its own moment. The woman left soon afterward, her visit accomplishing nothing except to confirm what Miss Marple already knew. The letter was dangerous not because of what it said, but because of what it threatened to reveal. It had been written by someone who understood the village well enough to know where silence had been carefully maintained. It named no crimes outright. It merely suggested connections, timelines, motives. Enough, Miss Marple reflected, to make very sensible people quite uneasy. By nightfall, the village felt smaller. Windows glowed behind drawn curtains. Doors closed earlier than usual. Miss Marple sat with her knitting once more, the letter beside her, its presence quiet but insistent. She thought of how often truth arrived disguised as something easily dismissed. A letter, a rumour, a careless remark. And she thought, too, of how rarely people conspired to hide something unless it was worth uncovering. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She did not yet know who had written it, nor precisely why it had been sent to her. But she was quite certain of one thing. By tomorrow, the effort to hide it would tell her everything she needed to know. Miss Marple slept that night as she always did, lightly, with the sort of rest that belonged to people who had long ago learned that the quiet hours were rarely as quiet as they seemed. Twice she woke, not from noise but from instinct, and once she rose to look out through the curtain at the lane. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no lamps, no late visitors. The village appeared innocent beneath the moonlight, cottages tucked neatly into darkness as though secrets were not part of their design. In the morning she carried on as usual. Tea was made, toast buttered, the knitting set neatly to one side. The letter remained in its envelope on the writing desk, as harmless-looking as ever. Miss Marple did not read it again. She had learned that repeating words too often made them dull. Instead, she let the day reveal how sharp those words truly were by watching who reacted to them. It began shortly after 9. A boy from the grocer's arrived with a small parcel that Miss Marple had not ordered. There was no note, only a ribbon tied with nervous haste. Inside was a tin of biscuits, good ones, expensive enough to be pointed, and a card with a single sentence written in a familiar hand, "Hope you are keeping well." Nothing else. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Gifts, she reflected, were often apologies in disguise, and apologies were rarely offered without cause. Before she had finished her tea there was another knock. This time it was the vicar himself, his face composed but his eyes slightly too bright, as though he had rehearsed kindness and found it exhausting. "My dear Miss Marple," he said warmly, stepping inside without waiting to be asked. "I thought I might call. We haven't properly spoken in ages." "That's very thoughtful," Miss Marple replied, offering him a chair. He refused it at first, then accepted after a moment, settling at the edge as though prepared to leave quickly if needed. He spoke of parish matters, of the roof repairs, of a committee meeting, his words flowing smoothly until they came to a careful pause. "I hear there have been whispers," he said lightly. "You know how villages are." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They whisper when they are afraid to speak." The vicar laughed in a small, strained way. "Quite. Quiet. Well, it's best not to pay attention. Rumours do more harm than good." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "rumours do harm by touching what people wish to keep untouched." His smile tightened. "If anything troubling were to come to you, an unpleasant note perhaps, it would be best to bring it to me at once. For your own peace of mind." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Thank you, Vicar. I do like peace of mind." He stood quickly, relieved to have made the suggestion. At the door he hesitated. "You will, of course, let me know if anything irregular occurs." "I always do," Miss Marple replied, and watched him leave with the briskness of a man escaping his own concern. By noon, 3 people had asked her, each in a different tone, whether she had received any odd post. The question was never direct. It arrived wrapped in friendliness, in concern, in gentle warnings, and each person, without exception, glanced at the writing desk as if expecting the envelope to leap up and announce itself. Miss Marple went into the village after lunch, not because she needed anything urgently, but because villages, like people, revealed themselves best in motion. She walked slowly, greeting those she passed, allowing conversation to come to her without chasing it. At the post office, Mrs. Ellery nearly pounced. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, lowering her voice immediately. "You know, something strange happened yesterday. 2 letters arrived that shouldn't have." "Shouldn't have?" Miss Marple echoed pleasantly. "Hand-delivered," Mrs. Ellery whispered, eyes bright with the excitement of danger at a safe distance. "No stamp, no return address, just slipped in through the slot. I only noticed because Mr. Larkin was here and he saw it too." "And who were they for?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ellery looked around, then leaned even closer. "One was for you." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "How interesting. And the other," Mrs. Ellery continued, "was for the solicitor's office. But do you know what happened? It vanished. The moment Mr. Larkin turned to pick up his parcel, it was gone from the counter." "Perhaps someone collected it," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Ellery's eyes glittered. "Not the solicitor. He hadn't even come in yet." Miss Marple thanked her, bought a stamp she didn't need, and left. Outside, she paused by the green and watched the comings and goings. People moved with purpose today, but not the relaxed purpose of errands. They moved in short bursts, from cottage to cottage, from shop to shop, pausing for too long in doorways, speaking in lowered voices, then breaking apart when someone else approached. She saw the woman who had visited her the night before, speaking with the loud-voiced man near the butcher's. Their faces were composed, but their hands moved as though restless. She saw the vicar again, crossing quickly from the churchyard to the school, his head bent, his pace too fast for a man who wished to appear calm. She saw the village's quiet authority, men who sat on committees, women who organized fetes, clustered near the gate of the largest house, speaking with a seriousness usually reserved for funerals. Miss Marple returned home in the late afternoon and found the 3rd attempt waiting for her. A man stood on her doorstep, hat in hand, smiling too brightly. He was not one of the village's obvious gossips. He was, on the contrary, one of its most dependable presences. Steady, respectable, and usually uninterested in anything he could not file and forget. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was just thinking we should have tea, catch up." "How kind," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside. He entered, eyes flicking immediately to the writing desk. His smile did not falter, but his breathing did, just slightly. He spoke of weather, of the price of coal, of the coming winter, and then, quite abruptly, he said, "If a letter were to arrive, you know, with unpleasant allegations, it would be best for everyone if it were dealt with quietly." Miss Marple poured tea calmly. "Yes," softening into persuasion, "these things can harm reputations, harm families, harm the village." Miss Marple set the cup before him. "And sometimes," she said gently, "they harm people precisely because they are true." The man's smile slipped for a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly. "Truth," he said carefully, "is not always helpful." Miss Marple smiled at him as if he were discussing jam recipes. "Oh, I think truth is always helpful. It's just not always pleasant." He drank his tea too fast, burned his tongue, and laughed as though it were amusing. When he left, he did so with the air of a man who had failed at something he could not admit he was attempting. Miss Marple sat alone afterward, hands folded, the house quiet around her. The letter remained where it had been, still unopened by anyone else, still harmless in appearance. But the village had spoken loudly enough. By trying to hide it, they had already revealed the outline of what it contained, not a single secret, but a shared one, something held in place not by one person's fear, but by many people's agreement. Miss Marple looked at the envelope and thought, with gentle certainty, that the most interesting question now was not who had written the letter. It was who, in a village full of respectable people, was most terrified of its words being read aloud. By the third day, the village had entered a curious state of cooperation without coordination. No one had agreed to anything formally, yet everyone seemed to know what was expected of them. Conversations were cautious. Questions were deflected. Ordinary kindness took on a brittle quality, as though each gesture were being weighed for unintended meaning. Miss Marple observed it all from her usual unobtrusive vantage points. She attended morning service and noticed which hymns were sung with enthusiasm and which were barely mouthed. She stood at the back of the shop and listened to the cadence of voices, noting where sentences trailed off or changed direction. She sat on a bench near the green and watched how people crossed toward one another, then subtly altered their path at the last moment. The letter, meanwhile, remained unseen but omnipresent. It had become a kind of invisible landmark, shaping movement and conversation without ever being mentioned directly. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an invitation that was not, strictly speaking, an invitation at all. It arrived by word of mouth, conveyed through a neighbour who pretended it was an afterthought. "They're having a small gathering at the solicitor's," the neighbour said lightly. "Just tea, nothing official, you might enjoy it." Miss Marple thanked her and said she would consider it. Consideration, she knew, was precisely what was being requested. Her presence would signal something, her absence would signal something else. She went. The solicitor's sitting room was neat to the point of austerity, its furnishings chosen for respectability rather than comfort. Tea was poured carefully, biscuits arranged with unnecessary precision. Those present included several of the village's most dependable figures: the vicar, a committee chairman, a woman known for charitable work, and a man whose family had lived in the village for generations without attracting attention. They spoke of neutral matters at first: accounts, repairs, a forthcoming event that might need postponing. Gradually, however, the conversation edged closer to its true purpose, like a tide that pretended not to be rising. "There's been a great deal of unnecessary tension," the charitable woman said gently. "People are worrying themselves for nothing." "Yes," the committee chairman agreed, "and worry spreads. It can do real damage." The vicar cleared his throat. It would be best if matters were clarified, quietly, sensibly. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing. The solicitor folded his hands. "We're all concerned for the village's reputation," he said. "Certain communications can be misinterpreted." "Misinterpretation," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "usually occurs when information is incomplete." There was a brief, uncomfortable pause. "Well," the solicitor continued carefully, "if someone were to possess a document of questionable reliability, it might be wise to assess its origin before allowing it to cause distress." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Of course, one should always consider why something was written, not merely what it says." Several people nodded, relieved, and, Miss Marple added, "one should also consider why it causes distress in the first place." The nodding stopped. Tea was finished soon afterward. The gathering dispersed with expressions of mutual respect that did not quite conceal disappointment. Miss Marple left with the clear impression that she had been weighed and found inconveniently balanced. On her way home, she walked more slowly than usual, replaying not the words spoken, but the reactions they had provoked. The charitable woman's hands had tightened around her cup when certain names were almost mentioned. The vicar had spoken most earnestly when urging silence. The solicitor had avoided looking directly at Miss Marple when discussing reliability. These were not the reactions of people afraid of a lie. That evening, Miss Marple did something she had not yet done. She took the letter from its envelope and read it once more, this time not as a whole but in parts. She examined the spacing, the phrasing, the order in which information was presented. It was not accusatory, it was methodical. Dates were given but without embellishment. Relationships were implied, not asserted. The tone was restrained, almost careful. Most telling of all, the letter assumed the reader would recognize the significance of what was being suggested. Miss Marple realized then that the writer had not intended the letter to stand alone. It was meant to be read by someone who already knew the village well enough to understand its implications, someone who would notice what was missing as much as what was present. The following morning she paid a visit to Mrs. Ellery at the post office, ostensibly to collect a parcel. She waited until the shop was empty. "You mentioned another letter," Miss Marple said casually, "the one that disappeared." Mrs. Ellery's eyes lit up. "Oh yes, very odd. I've been thinking about it." "Has it been sorted?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Mrs. Ellery said. "It was still on the counter." "And addressed to the solicitor, you said?" "Yes. Same sort of envelope as yours, I believe." "Handwriting similar?" Mrs. Ellery frowned. "I only glimpsed it, but yes, careful, very neat." Miss Marple nodded. "And who was present when it vanished?" "Well," Mrs. Ellery said slowly, "there was Mr. Henson, of course. He's always about." "And anyone else?" Mrs. Ellery hesitated. "The committee chairman popped in, only for a moment." "Did he handle the letter?" "I couldn't say," Mrs. Ellery replied. "I turned my back to fetch a parcel." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her thoughts arranging themselves quietly into alignment. The letter had not been meant for her alone. It had been distributed selectively, like a test. One recipient had allowed it to remain, another had not. That distinction, Miss Marple felt certain, would prove crucial. By the end of the day she had reached a conclusion that felt less like discovery and more like confirmation. The village was not united by ignorance, but by an old decision made collectively and never revisited. The letter threatened not a single person, but a shared convenience. It hinted at something that had been set aside for the sake of harmony and allowed to calcify into acceptance. Miss Marple placed the letter back on her desk and folded her hands. The question now was not whether the letter spoke the truth. It was how far the village would go to ensure that it never had to answer it. By the fourth day, the strain of unspoken agreement began to show. It surfaced not in arguments, but in fatigue. People grew careless. Smiles slipped too quickly. Words were chosen a fraction too late. The effort of maintaining a shared silence required more coordination than anyone had anticipated, and coordination, Miss Marple knew, always left traces. She noticed it first in the way doors were answered. Where once visitors were welcomed without hesitation, there was now a pause, a moment in which the occupant assessed who stood outside and why. The village had not closed itself entirely, but it had narrowed its thresholds. Miss Marple continued her routine as if nothing were amiss. She attended the knitting circle that afternoon, arriving a few minutes early and seating herself near the window. Conversation flowed at first, light and inconsequential, but it faltered whenever the talk brushed too close to certain names or dates. Needles clicked more sharply than usual. Teacups were refilled with unnecessary frequency. It was Mrs. Hargreaves who broke first. "I can't bear it," she said suddenly, her voice pitched too loudly for the room. "All this tiptoeing about. If something needs saying, it should be said." Several women glanced at one another. One cleared her throat. Another bent over her work with renewed intensity. Miss Marple did not look up. "People often say that," she remarked mildly, "but they rarely agree on who should say it." Mrs. Hargreaves flushed. "Well, someone must." "Yes," Miss Marple said. Eventually, the meeting ended early on the pretense of fading light. Miss Marple lingered just long enough to notice which women avoided her gaze and which looked at her with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Expectation, she reflected, was a dangerous thing to inspire unintentionally. That evening brought the first open confrontation. A man arrived at Rose Cottage just after dusk, his knock firm and unembarrassed. He was not one of the subtle ones. His authority came from habit rather than intelligence, and he was accustomed to being obeyed. Miss Marple invited him in and offered tea. He declined. "I'll be direct," he said, standing near the mantelpiece. "This business with the letter has gone far enough." "So quickly?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "It's unsettling people," he said. "There are families involved. Old matters best left alone." "Old matters," Miss Marple repeated, "have a habit of returning when ignored." He frowned. "You know what I mean." "I'm not sure I do," she replied gently. "You'll have to be more specific." His jaw tightened. "That letter, it serves no purpose now." "That depends," Miss Marple said, "on what purpose one believes it serves." He shifted his weight, irritation giving way to calculation. "If it were destroyed," he said carefully, "there would be relief all round." "Would there?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," he insisted. "Peace, stability." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Those are often the words used when truth is inconvenient." He bristled. "Truth is a matter of perspective." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "Truth is a matter of consequence." He stared at her for a moment, then exhaled sharply. "You're enjoying this?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied. "I rarely enjoy these things. I find them instructive." He left without taking tea. Miss Marple sat for some time afterward, reflecting on how quickly persuasion gave way to pressure when politeness failed. It was a predictable progression, and one that suggested the letter was closer to something dangerous than anyone wished to admit. The next morning the village responded with a different tactic. A notice appeared on the board by the green calling for a public meeting that evening. The wording was careful, almost bland, but Miss Marple recognized it for what it was, an attempt to contain the matter by absorbing it into procedure. Public discussion could be steered, questions could be framed, outcomes could be managed. Miss Marple attended. The hall filled quickly. People sat close together, drawing comfort from numbers. The chairman opened proceedings with practiced ease, speaking of unity, of the importance of trust, of avoiding unnecessary alarm. Others followed, echoing his sentiments with minor variations. Miss Marple listened, her attention focused not on what was said, but on what was avoided. Certain years were skipped, certain events were referred to obliquely or not at all. Names were substituted with titles, responsibility dissolved into generalities. At last someone asked the question that had been waiting all evening. "Is it true," a voice from the back called out, "that letters were sent?" A murmur rippled through the room. The chairman smiled tightly. "There have been communications," he said, "nothing of substance." Miss Marple raised her hand slightly. "Yes, Miss Marple?" the chairman said with forced courtesy. "Only a small point," she said gently. "If there is nothing of substance, why such concern?" The room stilled. The chairman cleared his throat. "We wish to prevent misunderstanding." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Misunderstandings occur when information is partial." Someone shifted in their seat. Another whispered sharply to their neighbor. "And," Miss Marple continued, "they persist when questions are discouraged." The chairman's smile faded. "Are you suggesting we invite speculation?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that speculation thrives best in silence." There was a stir then, not agreement, not opposition, but movement, the restless sign of thought breaking through habit. The meeting concluded soon afterward, its intended effect blunted. People left in clusters, speaking in low, urgent tones. Miss Marple walked home alone, the cool air steadying her thoughts. By nightfall, she was certain of one thing. The village had reached the limit of containment. Too many people had been involved for too long. Too many adjustments had been made quietly to preserve convenience. The letter was not the danger. The danger was what would happen if it remained hidden. Miss Marple sat at her desk and took out the envelope once more. She smoothed it carefully, aligning its edges with deliberate precision. Tomorrow, she decided, would require a different approach. Not confrontation, not exposure, but a test. People who hid things did so for reasons, and reasons, when pressed gently but persistently, had a way of revealing themselves. She placed the letter back on the desk, extinguished the lamp, and prepared for bed. Outside, the village lay quiet, holding its breath. Miss Marple did not. The test began the following morning with something so ordinary that no one thought to question it. Miss Marple went into the village earlier than usual, carrying her handbag and wearing the same mild expression she always wore when she wished to be overlooked. She did not hurry. Haste attracted notice, and notice was precisely what she intended to distribute unevenly. Her first stop was the baker's. She greeted him warmly, commented on the weather, and mentioned almost as an aside that she had slept poorly. "Too much on one's mind," she said with a small apologetic smile. The baker nodded sympathetically. "Yes," he said, "these things do have a way of spreading." Miss Marple paid for her loaf and left without elaborating. She had offered no information, only a suggestion. Already she could sense how eagerly it would be received. Next came the grocer's, then the post office. With each visit, Miss Marple repeated the same pattern, ordinary conversation, followed by a faint implication of disturbance. She never mentioned the letter directly. She did not need to. By mid-morning, the idea that Miss Marple was unsettled had taken on a life of its own. At the post office, Mrs. Ellery leaned forward almost immediately. "I heard you had a visitor last night," she whispered. "Did you?" Miss Marple replied mildly. "Yes. Someone better put it out, I'm told." Miss Marple smiled. "People are often put out when they feel uncertain." Mrs. Ellery's eyes gleamed. "Uncertain about what?" Miss Marple picked up her change carefully. "Oh, about many things." She left Mrs. Ellery with a great deal to think about and nothing concrete to repeat, an arrangement that would ensure embellishment. By lunchtime the village was humming. Miss Marple could feel it even from her sitting room, a faint tension in the air like the pressure before rain. She sat at her desk and took out the letter, reading it once more with deliberate care. Then she folded it and placed it back in the envelope. She did not seal it. Instead, she slipped the letter into her handbag and went out again. This time, she called on the woman who organized the knitting circle, a person whose sense of order was rivaled only by her appetite for certainty. They sat together over tea, discussing yarn and patterns, until Miss Marple allowed her handbag to fall open slightly. The woman noticed at once, her gaze fixed on the envelope, its careful handwriting just visible. "I hope I'm not being impertinent," she said hesitantly, "but is everything all right?" Miss Marple followed her gaze, then seemed to notice the envelope for the first time. "Oh dear," she said softly, "I didn't mean to bring that with me." The woman stiffened. "That? Nothing you need to concern yourself with," Miss Marple replied quickly, closing her bag. "I shouldn't have said anything." But of course she already had. When Miss Marple left, she did so with the certain knowledge that the envelope would be described in detail within the hour. The handwriting, the colour, the fact that it had been brought out of the house, the implication that something was about to happen. That afternoon she received her first reaction. A knock came at her door, brisk and impatient. This time it was the committee chairman, his manner strained beneath a veneer of civility. "I've been hearing things," he said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. "Talk, speculation." "Yes," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "The village does that." "You're encouraging it," he accused. "I haven't encouraged anything," she replied. "I've merely failed to prevent it." "That letter," he said sharply, "you intend to make it public." Miss Marple looked at him in gentle surprise. "Did I say that?" "You don't need to," he snapped. "Everyone knows." "Everyone," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "often knows things no one has actually said." He ran a hand through his hair. "This cannot go any further." "Why not?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Because," he said, then stopped. Miss Marple waited. "Because it will drag up matters that were settled long ago," he finished. "Settled," she echoed, "or merely set aside?" His silence was answer enough. That evening the second reaction arrived. A small group gathered outside Rose Cottage just after dusk. They did not knock at first. They stood together, speaking in low voices, until one of them, emboldened by numbers, stepped forward. Miss Marple opened the door before they could knock, her expression mild. "Good evening," she said. "How neighbourly." They exchanged glances. The vicar spoke first. "We're concerned," he said carefully, "concerned for you and for the village. Miss Marple nodded. "Concern often brings people together. We understand," the vicar continued, "that you possess a letter, one that could cause considerable distress." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Distress is caused by many things, silence among them." Another voice broke in. "You don't know the whole story." "That may be so," Miss Marple replied, "but I know enough to ask why it was hidden." A murmur ran through the group. "You must understand," the charitable woman said, "that some truths do more harm than good." Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. "That depends," she said, "on whom the harm is meant to protect." The group shifted uneasily. They had come prepared to persuade, perhaps even to pressure. They had not come prepared to explain. "You're forcing our hand," the committee chairman said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, I'm merely letting go of yours." The group left soon afterward, their unity fractured by the realization that agreement required more than shared fear. As their footsteps faded, Miss Marple closed the door and returned to her desk. She placed the letter in front of her and considered the results of her test. Those who were innocent had been curious, uneasy, or confused. Those who were implicated had been urgent. They had not asked what the letter said. They had asked what she intended to do with it. That distinction, Miss Marple knew, was decisive. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Tomorrow she will move to the next stage. Not revelation, but confirmation. Someone, somewhere in the village, would make a mistake. They always did, and when they did, the letter would no longer need to be read aloud at all. The mistake came sooner than Miss Marple had expected, which was often the way of such things. Pressure, when applied unevenly, rarely produced patience. It produced haste. It arrived in the form of a conversation she was never meant to overhear. That afternoon Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane that curved behind the old schoolhouse, a route she favoured precisely because it was considered unimportant. People did not guard their words in places they believed were inconsequential. They saved caution for parlours and meeting halls. She had reached the hedge near the back gate of the solicitor's garden when voices carried toward her, sharp with urgency. She slowed, not stopping outright, merely adjusting her pace so that her presence might be mistaken for distance. "This is getting out of hand," a man's voice said. "She's doing it deliberately." "We knew she would," another replied. "That's why the letter should never have been sent." Miss Marple felt a small tightening of certainty. "You said it was necessary," the first voice continued, "that she would understand." "I said she would notice," the second corrected, "not that she would comply." Miss Marple continued walking, her expression placid, her attention keen. "What if she shows it to someone else?" the first man asked. "She won't," the second said quickly. "Not yet." "And how can you be so sure?" There was a pause. "Because it isn't the letter she's after," the second voice said. "It's the reaction." Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest inward smile. "So what do we do?" the first asked. "We wait," the second replied, "and we make certain no one else talks." Miss Marple stepped forward then, deliberately scuffing her shoe against the gravel. The voices broke off at once. She emerged into view, knitting a bag over her arm, smiling pleasantly. "Good afternoon," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." The men stared at her, startled into stillness. One recovered quickly, adopting a genial expression that did not quite reach his eyes. "Not at all," he said. "Just discussing garden matters." "How fortunate," Miss Marple replied. "Gardens require so much discussion." They murmured polite responses and retreated hastily into the house. Miss Marple continued on her way without looking back. By evening, the second mistake followed. A note arrived at Rose Cottage, delivered by hand and slipped beneath the door with considerably less care than the first letter had been. Miss Marple found it upon her return, folded twice and unsealed, as though secrecy had become a burden rather than a strategy. The handwriting was different this time. Less controlled, pressed too firmly, betraying agitation. It contained only one sentence. "You are being misled. The letter is incomplete." Miss Marple read it once, then again. She did not smile. "Incomplete. she reflected, was a revealing choice of word. She placed the note beside the original letter on her desk and compared them. Different hands, different intentions. The first had been written to reveal, the second had been written to contain. That night, she did something else quite deliberate. She left her sitting room curtains open. From the lane, the light on her desk was clearly visible. So too were the papers laid out upon it. Miss Marple did not arrange them to be legible. She did not need to. The suggestion of exposure was far more effective than the act itself. She settled into her chair with her knitting and waited. It did not take long. A shadow crossed the window just after 9, then another. Footsteps approached the cottage, hesitated, retreated, then returned with more determination. The knock that followed was careful but insistent. Miss Marple opened the door to find the solicitor standing there, his usual composure cracked by unease. He did not bother with pleasantries. "You received another note," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I did." His eyes flicked past her toward the desk. "You see how dangerous this has become?" "Dangerous things," Miss Marple said gently, "are rarely improved by partial truths." He stepped inside without being invited. "You don't understand the full context." "That may be so," Miss Marple agreed, "but you seem to." He stiffened. "You're drawing conclusions." "I'm observing patterns," she replied. "They tend to repeat." He ran a hand over his face. "The letter wasn't meant to cause harm." "Most things aren't," Miss Marple said. "That doesn't prevent them." "There were reasons," he said, voice lowering. "Complicated ones." "Complications," Miss Marple said, "are often the result of too many people agreeing to look away at once." He met her gaze then, and for the first time his expression held something like appeal. "If this goes further," he said, "it will undo more than you realize." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "If it does not," she replied, "it already has." He exhaled slowly. "You won't find what you think you will." "I already have," Miss Marple said softly. He froze. "You see," she continued, "you and several others have made the same mistake. You believe the letter contains the truth." He said nothing. "It does not," Miss Marple went on. "It merely points toward it, and your efforts to suppress it have filled in everything else." She moved to the desk and picked up the original letter. "This was written by someone who wanted acknowledgement," she said. "Not justice, not revenge, just acknowledgement of what was done." She placed it down and picked up the second note. "This," she said, "was written by someone who wanted control." The solicitor's shoulders sagged slightly. "You don't know how it started?" "No," Miss Marple said, "but I know how it continued." Silence settled between them, thick and unavoidable. "At some point," Miss Marple added gently, "a choice was made to preserve harmony rather than fairness, and once made, it required constant maintenance, silence, cooperation, selective memory." "You make it sound calculated," he said. "Habitual," Miss Marple corrected. "Which is much worse." He looked at the floor. "What will you do now?" Miss Marple considered him for a moment. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "I shall simply wait." "For what?" "For someone," Miss Marple replied, "to attempt to correct the letter." He looked up sharply. "Only someone with intimate knowledge would know what was missing," she said, "and only someone afraid would try to supply it." The solicitor closed his eyes briefly. "That," Miss Marple said gently, "will be the final mistake." He left without another word. Miss Marple closed the door and returned to her chair. She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the lamplight. Outside, the village lay quiet, but she could feel the tension running beneath it like a tightened wire. The truth was no longer hidden. It was circling, and very soon someone would reach out to grasp it, forgetting in their urgency that such things were best left untouched until they revealed themselves. By the next morning the village had lost its careful rhythm. What had once been discreet coordination gave way to fractured intent. People no longer spoke in code, they spoke in fragments. Half-finished sentences trailed off into silence. Names were almost said, then swallowed. The strain of holding a shared secret had begun to exceed the comfort it provided. Miss Marple noticed the change immediately. It was there in the way doors were closed more firmly than usual, in the way greetings were shortened, in the way eyes lingered too long on her face before sliding away. She had become, without ever announcing herself, a fixed point around which anxiety now revolved. She went into the village late that morning, deliberately later than her usual hour. Timing mattered. Those who wished to avoid her would already have passed through the shops. Those who could not would have to endure the encounter. At the post office, Mrs. Ellery was unusually subdued. Her habitual eagerness had dulled into something closer to apprehension. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, forcing brightness. "Good morning," Miss Marple replied. "You look tired." Mrs. Ellery flinched. "Oh, well, too much thinking, I suppose." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Thinking can be exhausting when one has been avoiding it." Mrs. Ellery laughed weakly, then leaned closer. "You know," she whispered, "people are saying all sorts of things." "I imagine they are," Miss Marple said calmly. "Some say the letter refers to something that happened years ago," Mrs. Ellery continued. "Others say it concerns money, or inheritance, or a child." Miss Marple met her gaze kindly. "Speculation tends to grow where clarity is denied." Mrs. Ellery swallowed. "Is it true that someone tried to amend it?" Miss Marple paused just long enough. "Someone tried," she said, "to explain it away." Mrs. Ellery's face was drained of colour. "Then it is true?" Miss Marple did not correct her. Outside she encountered the charitable woman walking briskly, her coat buttoned too tightly, her expression resolute in the way people wore when they had made a decision they disliked, but felt compelled to honour. "Miss Marple," she said, stopping abruptly, "may I speak with you?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied. They stood beside the green, the open space offering no cover for evasion. "This has gone far enough," the woman said. "You're frightening people." "Fear," Miss Marple said gently, "rarely comes from questions. It comes from answers long delayed." The woman's composure cracked. "You don't know what it cost us." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "Then perhaps it is time someone did." The woman's hands clenched. "We thought we were doing the right thing." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "People usually do." The woman turned away abruptly and walked on, shoulders rigid. Miss Marple returned home by early afternoon and found her gate ajar. It had not been left that way accidentally. She noted it, closed it carefully, and entered the house. Inside nothing appeared disturbed, but the air had changed. Someone had been there, briefly and without success. She went to her desk at once. The letter lay exactly where she had left it. So did the second note. But beside them now was something new. A folded sheet of paper placed with deliberate care. Miss Marple did not touch it immediately. She sat down, removed her gloves, and folded them neatly in her handbag. Only then did she open the paper. This time, there was no attempt at subtlety. "You are wrong about why it was hidden. It was not convenient. It was mercy." Miss Marple read the sentence twice. Mercy, she reflected, was another interesting word. She turned the page. There was more. What happened cannot be undone, but exposure will harm those who had no part in the original act. Children, families, the village itself. Miss Marple folded the paper and placed it beside the others. She felt no satisfaction, only certainty. The letter had finally been corrected, not with facts, but with motive, and motive, she knew, belonged to those who had acted, not those who merely observed. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching the lane. It was quiet now, but not peaceful. The village was holding itself still, waiting for something to happen. Late in the afternoon, the final visitor arrived. It was the man whose name had not yet been spoken aloud, but whose presence had hovered at the edges of every conversation. He was neither the loudest nor the most powerful, but he was central in a way few noticed until too late. He stood on her doorstep without knocking, hat in hand, his expression grave but determined. "I suppose it's time," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "I believe it is." She let him in. He did not sit. He paced instead, the room suddenly too small for him. "You think you know," he said. "But you don't." "I know enough," Miss Marple replied gently. "You think it was planned," he continued, "calculated." "I think," Miss Marple said, "that it was chosen." He stopped pacing. "It was an accident." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Accidents do not require silence afterward." He flinched. "We were protecting someone." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And in doing so you condemned someone else." He stared at her. "You weren't there." "No," she agreed, "but I've seen the aftermath often enough." He laughed bitterly. "You think exposure will fix it?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "I think acknowledgement will." He shook his head. "The village will never forgive us." Miss Marple met his gaze. "The village already knows," she said. "It simply hasn't been allowed to say so." Silence stretched between them. At some point Miss Marple continued softly, "Mercy must include truth. Otherwise, it is only fear wearing a kinder face." His shoulders sagged. "What will you do?" Miss Marple considered him carefully. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will invite those who received letters to tea." He looked up sharply. "All of them?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "including the one who tried to change the story." "And then?" "And then," Miss Marple said gently, "I shall listen." He closed his eyes. "That will be enough." "It usually is," Miss Marple replied. When he left, the house felt lighter, as though a door had been opened that could no longer be closed. Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. Her hands were steady. The test had worked. The village had done what it always did under pressure. It had told the truth, not loudly, not proudly, but all the same. Tomorrow will bring the final stage, not accusation, but revelation offered quietly where denial could no longer hide. The following afternoon unfolded with deceptive calm. The village wore its most respectable face, as though routine alone might ward off consequence. Curtains were drawn back, doors opened at their usual hours, and the green looked no different than it had the week before. Only those who listened closely could hear the strain beneath the surface, the faint discord in familiar notes. Miss Marple prepared carefully. She set out her best china, not to impress, but to reassure. People relaxed when surroundings suggested order. The kettle was placed on the stove well ahead of time. Chairs were arranged in a loose circle rather than in a formal line, an unconscious invitation to speak rather than to perform. They arrived in ones and twos precisely as she had expected. The solicitor came first, his expression guarded, his greeting polite to the point of stiffness. The committee chairman followed, avoiding eye contact as though it might entangle him. The charitable woman arrived with a plate of cakes she had baked herself, an offering that carried apology in every careful detail. The vicar came last, his smile composed, his eyes searching. Each of them had received a letter. Miss Marple greeted them all warmly, thanking them for coming, making light conversation while tea was poured. For a few minutes they discussed weather and village matters, clinging to the safety of the ordinary. Cups clinked. Saucers were adjusted. No one mentioned why they were there. At last Miss Marple set her own cup down and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm very grateful to you all," she said gently, "for coming this afternoon." There was a collective murmur of assent, cautious and restrained. "I thought," she continued, "that it might be helpful for us to be together rather than speaking in fragments." The solicitor cleared his throat. "I'm not sure what good that will do." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It often does more good than we expect." She reached for the envelope on the table and placed it between them, unopened. The movement was small, but it drew every eye. "I have no intention," she said calmly, "of reading this aloud." Relief flickered across several faces, too quickly suppressed. "But," Miss Marple went on, "I would like to speak about why it was written." The committee chairman shifted in his seat. "We've discussed this already." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "In pieces." The vicar leaned forward slightly. "We were trying to prevent harm." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "You all were." The charitable woman's voice trembled. "You make it sound selfish." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I make it sound human." Silence settled, not uncomfortable yet, but attentive. "This letter," Miss Marple continued, "does not accuse, it reminds me. It does not demand punishment, it asks for acknowledgement." The solicitor frowned. "Acknowledgement of what?" Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Of a choice that was made." No one spoke. "A choice," Miss Marple repeated softly, "to allow a convenient version of events to stand because it spared discomfort. A choice to protect the village's sense of itself, even at the expense of fairness." The committee chairman's hands clenched together. It wasn't that simple. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "it never is." She let her gaze move around the circle. Each of you in your own way agreed that silence was preferable, and each of you told yourself a different reason. The charitable woman spoke at last. "We believed we were doing good." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "That is what makes it so enduring." The vicar's voice was quiet. "If it had come out then, lives would have been ruined." "Lives were altered regardless," Miss Marple replied. "They were simply altered quietly." The solicitor rubbed his forehead. "And now?" "Now," Miss Marple said, "the cost of silence has risen." She did not look at the envelope again. She did not need to. "One of you," she continued, "attempted to amend the story." The committee chairman looked up sharply. "Amend? To soften it," Miss Marple said. "To reframe motive as mercy rather than convenience." The charitable woman's breath caught. "That wasn't—" "It was understandable," Miss Marple said gently, "but it was revealing." The solicitor closed his eyes briefly. "You're asking us to confess." "No," Miss Marple replied. "I'm asking you to stop maintaining a fiction." The vicar's shoulders sagged. "And if we don't?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then the village will continue as it has been, with a tension it cannot name and a truth it cannot forget." Silence stretched, deeper now, heavier. The committee chairman spoke, his voice low. "What does the writer want?" "Very little," Miss Marple replied. "Recognition that what happened was known and chosen." "And you?" the solicitor asked. "I want nothing," Miss Marple said, "except that you understand the letter has already done its work." The charitable woman's eyes filled with tears. "We thought we were protecting the village." "You were," Miss Marple said. "From discomfort, not from consequence." The vicar stood abruptly. "I cannot endorse this," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "You needn't. Endorsement is not required." He hesitated, then sat back down, his defiance spent. Miss Marple rose slowly. "I will not expose this publicly," she said. "There will be no announcement, no spectacle." Relief moved through the room, quickly followed by something else, uncertainty. But Miss Marple continued, "I will not help preserve a lie." The solicitor looked at the envelope. "What will you do with it?" "I will keep it," Miss Marple replied. "As a reminder." The committee chairman swallowed. "And the village?" "The village," Miss Marple said gently, "will adjust. It always does." They left not together but separately, each carrying a private reckoning. Miss Marple watched from the doorway as they dispersed. Their careful unity dissolved. When the house was quiet again, she returned to the table and gathered the cups. Her hands did not tremble. The letter remained unopened. It no longer needed to be read. The village changed slowly after that, so slowly that no one could have pointed to a single moment when the shift occurred. It was not announced. There were no meetings, no resolutions passed, no apologies made in public. And yet, something essential had been loosened, as though a knot long kept tight had finally been allowed to slacken. Miss Marple noticed it first in the way people spoke. Conversations no longer curved so carefully around certain subjects. Names were mentioned where before there had been titles. Dates were recalled with less hesitation. People did not tell the story outright, but they stopped pretending it had never existed. She walked through the village one afternoon and observed how doors opened more readily again. There was less checking of faces, less calculation before speech. Relief, she knew, did not always come with happiness. Sometimes it arrived simply as the absence of strain. At the post office, Mrs. Ellery no longer whispered. She lowered her voice out of habit, perhaps, but her words carried a new steadiness. "It's been easier to sleep," she admitted, as though confessing something improper. "I didn't realize how much that business was sitting on me." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Unspoken things have weight. At the butcher's, two men discussed a matter they had avoided for years, disagreeing openly and parting without discomfort. At the Green, a group of women spoke of the past with surprising candor, not cruelly, but without the careful omissions that had once defined their stories. Miss Marple did not intervene. She did not guide these conversations or encourage them. She merely listened and noted how naturally truth reasserted itself once it was no longer actively suppressed. The writer of the letter remained unknown to most, and that was as it should be. Whoever it was had not sought recognition. Miss Marple suspected that anonymity had been essential to the letter's purpose. A known voice could have been dismissed. An unnamed one had forced the village to look inward instead. She did, however, notice one absence. The man who had come to her house the day before the gathering had not been seen since. His cottage stood closed, its curtains drawn even in daylight. People mentioned him occasionally, always with a pause, always with an unspoken understanding that he would not be returning soon, if at all. Miss Marple reflected that withdrawal was often the final stage of such affairs. When denial failed and justification faltered, distance became the last refuge. One evening the vicar called upon her again. This time his manner was different, less careful, more tired. "I wanted to say," he began, then stopped. He seemed uncertain how to continue. Miss Marple waited. "I don't agree with everything you did," he said at last. "No," Miss Marple replied, "I didn't expect you would. But I can see now," he continued slowly, "that what we called mercy had begun to resemble fear." Miss Marple nodded. "They often wear the same clothes," he sighed. "I wish we had spoken earlier." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "so do many people." He left soon afterward, not absolved but quieter in himself. As the days passed, small practical changes followed. Records were amended quietly. A decision made years earlier was reconsidered, not reversed exactly, but acknowledged in a way that allowed those affected to feel seen. It was not justice in any formal sense, but it was recognition, and recognition mattered. Miss Marple understood that the village would never fully admit what it had done. That would require a courage few communities possessed. Instead, it would adjust its behavior, its language, its habits. It would be kinder in some ways, more cautious in others. That was enough. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, she took out the letter once more. She read it slowly, not for information now, but for intention. It had been written with care, not anger, with restraint, not bitterness. Whoever had written it had understood that exposure was not always the most effective remedy. She folded it again and placed it back in its envelope. The letter had never been a weapon. It had been a mirror. Outside, the village moved through another ordinary day. Children played. Someone laughed. A door slammed and was reopened with an apology. Life continued, imperfect and persistent. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The truth had not been shouted. It had not needed to be. It had been allowed to settle, to seep into conversation and conscience alike. And in doing so, It had accomplished what confrontation rarely did. It had changed how people behaved when they believed no one was watching. As evening fell, Miss Marple prepared her supper and reflected that this, more than any confession, was the real measure of resolution, not punishment, not exposure, but adjustment. She extinguished the lamp later that night and stood for a moment at the window, looking out at the darkened lane. The village slept, not innocent, but quieter within itself. Miss Marple drew the curtains and turned away, content that the final movement was already underway. Tomorrow would bring the last stage, not of revelation, but of acceptance, and that, she knew, was the hardest part of all. The final stage arrived without ceremony, as Miss Marple had known it would. Acceptance rarely announced itself. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine, until one day people realized they were living differently and could no longer remember precisely when the change had begun. The village settled into this new shape with cautious grace. It did not speak of absolution or forgiveness. Instead, it practiced something more practical. People corrected themselves when they spoke. They paused before dismissing uncomfortable memories. They listened when someone insisted on telling a story that did not fit the softened version everyone had grown used to repeating. Miss Marple observed these shifts with calm attentiveness. She noticed how the committee chairman now asked more questions than he answered, how the charitable woman no longer rushed to explain motives on behalf of others, how the solicitor's advice, once designed to preserve harmony at all costs, now came with longer silences and fewer certainties. One afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the schoolhouse, a modest affair attended by several women who had once avoided her gaze. The invitation itself was significant. It was not framed as curiosity or obligation, but as welcome. They spoke of everyday matters at first, lessons, weather, a leaking roof. Then gradually one of them said, "I've been thinking about how we used to handle things." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "I imagine many people have." "We thought keeping quiet was kindness," another woman said, "but it never felt quite right." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Kindness that demands silence often asks too much." No one contradicted her. As winter softened into early spring, the last practical consequence unfolded. A decision made long ago was formally revisited, not undone entirely but addressed openly enough that those affected were no longer invisible. There was no public reckoning, no speeches, no announcements, just a quiet correction, noted in records and reflected in behavior. Miss Marple understood the significance at once. This was as much as the village could manage, and perhaps as much as it needed. Justice, she believed, was not a single action, but a pattern of choices repeated over time. One evening, as she walked home along the lane, she encountered the young woman who had once brought apples to her door. They walked together for a short distance, neither speaking at first. "I feel lighter," the young woman said at last, surprised by her own admission. "As though something has been set down." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is often what truth does, once it is allowed to exist." "Will it ever be spoken of plainly?" the young woman asked. "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said, "but it will be accounted for. That is more important." They parted at the crossroads, the young woman turning back once to smile in quiet gratitude. That night, Miss Marple sat at her desk and took out the letter one final time. She read it slowly, not because she needed its contents, but because she wished to acknowledge the intention behind it. The writer had not demanded justice. They had not sought revenge. They had simply refused to carry the burden alone any longer. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small box where she kept other reminders of human nature, items that had once altered lives without ever appearing remarkable. She did not destroy it. Destruction, she knew, was too close to denial. Outside, the village prepared for another ordinary day. Lamps were extinguished, curtains drawn. Somewhere, a door was left unlocked without fear. The quiet felt different now, not empty, but settled. Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea and reflected on the matter as a whole. The letter everyone had tried to hide had not revealed a single dramatic crime. It had revealed something far more common and far more dangerous: the ease with which decent people could agree to look away, and the effort required to stop doing so. She had not accused anyone, she had not exposed anyone, she had simply allowed people to see themselves clearly, and that, she believed, was the most difficult exposure of all. When she went to bed, she slept deeply, untroubled by instinct or unease. The village had found its balance again, not by erasing the past, but by making room for it. In the weeks that followed, the story faded into something less sharp, names blurred, details softened, but the adjustment remained. It lived in how decisions were made, how disagreements were handled, how silence was no longer mistaken for virtue. Miss Marple returned fully to her quiet routines, knitting, walking, listening. She remained what she had always been, an unassuming figure in the background of village life, easily overlooked by those who preferred not to think too closely. And yet the village would never quite overlook her again. The letter had passed into stillness, its purpose fulfilled. It no longer needed to be hidden, because it was no longer threatened. Its truth had been absorbed, not into records or confessions, but into conscience. Miss Marple looked out at the lane one last time before drawing the curtains. She felt no triumph, no sense of conclusion beyond a gentle rightness. Some mysteries ended with exposure. This one ended with recognition, and recognition, she knew, was the rarest resolution of all.